You are in the middle of a conversation. The other person is talking. You are nodding. You are present enough that nothing seems wrong from the outside. But somewhere around the third sentence, something they said triggered a thought. And that thought connected to something else. And now, there is an entire internal conversation happening that has nothing to do with what is being said in front of you. And then you realize they stop talking. They are looking at you, waiting, and you say, "Sorry, what was that?" This is not occasional. This is just how it is. The internal world pulls harder than the external one most of the time. Thoughts arrive uninvited and demand attention. Ideas generate other ideas before the first one is finished. You can spend an hour somewhere without fully being there because something inside was more interesting, or more urgent, or just louder than whatever was happening outside. From the outside, this looks like distraction, like absence, like someone who is not quite all the way here. From the inside, it feels like being more here than anywhere else. Psychology has a term for the brain's default activity when it is not focused on an external task. The default mode network, a set of interconnected brain regions that activate automatically when attention is not directed outward. This network is associated with self-referential thinking, imagination, memory consolidation, future planning, and the kind of loose associative thinking that connects ideas across unrelated domains. In other words, it is the network that runs when you are inside your own head. What researchers have found is that this network is not idle. It is not the brain doing nothing while it waits for something real to happen. It is performing some of the most cognitively sophisticated work the brain is capable of, integrating experiences, generating hypothetical scenarios, building and rebuilding the internal narrative that forms the foundation of identity. But here is what makes this relevant. People differ substantially in how active this network is and how easily external stimulation competes with it. For some people, the pull of the internal world is simply stronger. Not because something is wrong, because the default mode network is running at a higher intensity and the threshold required to redirect attention outward is higher than average. There is a concept in psychology called absorption, the tendency to become deeply immersed in mental experience. People high in absorption lose track of time easily. They become genuinely transported by music, books, and ideas. They find internal experience as vivid and engaging as external reality, sometimes more so. Researcher Oak Tellegen, who studied this trait extensively, found it to be stable across time and relatively consistent across situations. It is not a mood or a phase. It is a fundamental characteristic of how certain people process experience, with depth, with immersion, with a level of internal engagement that most people simply do not have access to in the same way. And for people high in absorption, the internal world is not a consolation prize for when the external one is disappointing. It is a genuine place, rich, detailed, continuously active. It does not require anything to happen on the outside to generate compelling material on the inside. A significant number of people who live primarily inside their own heads developed that orientation for reasons that had nothing to do with personality. When the external environment was unpredictable, emotionally unsafe, or simply not responsive in the ways a child needed, withdrawal into internal experience becomes a completely rational adaptation. The outside world was not reliable. The inside world was entirely under your control. You could build things there. You could process things there. You could exist there without the complications and unpredictabilities that came with being fully present in the external environment. And what begins as a coping mechanism gradually becomes a habitat. The internal world gets more developed, more detailed, more interesting. The capacity for external engagement, which was never fully built to begin with, stays underdeveloped by comparison. And by adulthood, the preference is so established that it no longer feels like a preference. It just feels like who you are. This does not mean the external world stops mattering. It means the internal world became primary so early and so thoroughly that navigating the gap between the two requires effort that other people do not seem to need. There is something specific that happens in relationships for people who live this way. You are capable of extraordinary depth in connection. When you are genuinely present with someone, when they have made it past the threshold where the internal world steps back and lets something in, you are more there than most people know how to be. You listen differently. You engage with ideas at a level that most people find either exhilarating or slightly exhausting, depending on where they are. But getting to that threshold is inconsistent, and the people in your life feel it. Because most of the time, you are partly somewhere else. Not gone. Not indifferent. Just divided in a way that is difficult to explain without sounding like you are making excuses. And the people who care about you, who can sense that there is a version of you that is fully present and find it remarkable when it arrives, sometimes spend a lot of time wondering where that version went and whether they did something to make it leave. You did not go anywhere. You were just inside. Here is something that takes a long time to understand about living this way. The internal world feels like the safest place. It is always available. It does not require anything from you that you are not prepared to give. It does not misunderstand you or demand explanations or respond in ways you did not anticipate. But it also does not push back. It does not offer the friction that changes things. It does not provide the kind of information that only comes from genuine contact with other people and situations, the kind that updates your assumptions and revises your understanding of yourself in ways that purely internal processing never can. A mind that spends most of its time talking to itself eventually starts to hear only itself. The thoughts become more elaborate but less grounded. The internal narratives become more sophisticated but less tested, and the gap between the internal world and the external one, which always existed, starts to widen in ways that become harder to cross. The internal world is not the problem. The depth of processing that comes with living inside your own head produces things that purely external engagement never would. Ideas, perspectives, a quality of understanding that requires exactly that kind of sustained internal attention to develop. The question is never whether to have an internal world. It is whether it stays connected to something outside itself. Because the most interesting version of a mind like this is not the one that withdraws completely. It is the one that goes deep and comes back. That takes what it found inside and finds a way to bring it out. That uses the internal world not as a place to stay permanently, but as a place to return to, while remaining, somehow, genuinely present in the one that exists outside it as well.